And so now we are going into our last panel of the day before we get to the workshop. So there's still more to come. So panel 5 right now, what students face when figuring out how to pay for college. This will be a discussion about total cost of attendance here. What does a student have to do in order to figure out how to pay for college? And with that, I will be passing the mic off to Farshawn at UAspire. Farshawn, do we have you on the line? Right, I see we have our speakers coming in. Again, this is a great conversation. We're going to go into more details, not about the entire college affordability spectrum. So stay tuned. And again, we still have another pop quiz coming up, so be paying attention. And Farshawn, I see you now. I'll hand it off to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Hello, everybody. Great to see everyone virtually, and so excited to be having this panel and moderating this. We have a panel of all-stars here today who are here to talk about the burden of student debt and how it inequitably falls on students who've been historically left out of higher education. So we're going to have a short presentation at the beginning, and then we're gonna go into some Q&A with our participants, and finally open it up for Q&A to anybody on here who has questions for our panelists as well. So I want to first start with some intros and ask our awesome panelists to go ahead and introduce yourselves, give yourself titles, your affiliation, and a brief description of the work that you do with your organization. And so with that, I will go ahead and do my own intro. My name is Parshan. I am the policy director for UAspire, and I'll be moderating this panel today. So I will pass it to Althea today to do your intro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Althea Ito. My pronouns are she, her, sha, and I currently serve as the organizing director for UC Berkeley on behalf of UCSA, or the University of California Student Association. In this role, I work to mobilize our campus community around statewide campaigns and advocacy efforts that specifically address issues like educational access, affordability, and equity. My specific focus and capacity is in trying to do my best in helping students translate their lived experiences into actionable narratives that highlight the urgency of issues like educational equity and affordability, both on campus and outside of campus, whether we be in the state legislature like SAC or DC.
Excellent. Thank you, Althea. We're going to go to Adrian next.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrian Sanchez. I apologize, my dog is barking in the background. But I am the Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the California State Student Association. And basically, I represent the California State University students to the state government and the federal government, and I aid in those advocacy efforts and inform the students on our board. So kind of like Althea, I do have some priorities, which include the affordability of higher education and also fighting hard for Cal Grant reform this year. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Adrian. And last but certainly not least, going to Lori.
Thanks so much, Parshan. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Szabo-Kubitz, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor at the Institute for College Access and Success, also known as TCAS. where we advocate for every student, regardless of race, ethnicity, or family wealth, to have access to a quality higher education program without the need to incur debt to realize their dreams of earning a higher education credential. The two kind of main focuses of our work are on affordability and accountability, and I personally have focused for many years on our California affordability portfolio.
Awesome, awesome. Before we go to our panel start, I want to also give a shout out to Kimberly, who is here. You all can see Kimberly's icon here as well, and is staffing and supporting us in the back end, and all the Next Gen staff who've been helping us, and all the volunteers and supporters of the Free My Future Summit. So thank you all for this. Is not easy to be put together, but we're so lucky to have the space to chat about it. So we're going to kick it off with a presentation, which I know, Laura, you all have put together on just giving us some lay of the land of what we're looking at here. So passing it back to you, Laura.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to be focusing on the 3 reports that we've written with the 3 statewide student associations, the SSCCC, CSSA, and UCSA over the last year, where we've looked at the college affordability landscape across California's public higher education segments. I'll note that our reports with CSSA and UCSA are updates to our original analyses from about 5 or 6 years ago. And so we also provide insight into the extent to which affordability trends have changed or remained the same over the last several years. So across all 3 public higher education systems, the total cost of college significantly exceeds tuition, encompassing essential non-tuition expenses such as living costs, transportation, and books and supplies, among other expenses. This financial burden weighs particularly heavily on low-income families, even after receiving financial aid to cover college costs. And this is also true at the California community colleges, where despite having the lowest tuition in the nation, total college costs can exceed $30,000 annually. So our recent analysis with our partners at the SSCCC looked at several factors that impact college affordability, including student borrowing. While just under 1%, so not very many, of CCC students received loans in academic year 2021-22, it's really important to underscore that equity gaps do exist. For example, while Black students made up 5% of system-wide enrollment that year, about 20%, or 4 times that share, of CCC student borrowers were Black. Additionally, 85% of student borrowers were Pell Grant recipients, with average parental and student adjusted gross incomes of about $29,000 and $19,000 respectively. And at 94% and 96%, Black and Native American borrowers were the most likely among all racial and ethnic groups to have received a Pell Grant. Next, our analysis with CSSA looked beneath overall borrowing averages to see how students are impacted by family income, race and ethnicity, and self-reported disability status. Compared to our original analysis in late 2017, borrowing rates decreased across the board from 52% to 38%. However, we do see that equity gaps have persisted. And I do want to note, I apologize that one of the stats in this slide is from our UCSA report. So I'll make sure that I send an updated slide to Sam later. But I will say verbally to explain about how these equity gaps have persisted. The majority of American Indian or Alaska Native and Black or African American graduates had borrowed to fund their education. So those were the highest borrowing rates among all races and ethnicities. And similar to our original analysis, BA recipients from the lowest income families compose the largest share of borrowers. Nearly 2/3 of graduates with debt came from families making no more than $54,000 annually. And that is $30,000 less than the median household income in California. So we're really seeing the disproportionate impact of student borrowing on certain races and ethnicities and also lower income graduates. And finally, our analysis with UCSA, looking at UC bachelor's degree recipients, also found that borrowing rates decreased over the past several years from 50% to 40%, but again, with inequities persisting. The lowest income students continue to be almost 3 times as likely to borrow as their wealthiest peers. Chicano, Latino, and African American students remain the most likely to have borrowed. And students with self-reported disabilities appear more likely than their peers without a self-reported disability to have borrowed across all income, family household incomes. So just wanted to give everyone here, a snapshot of these 3 reports. To learn more about our findings, you can go to the TICAS website at ticas.org. And also, I'm sure there'll be opportunity to delve in more on this panel. Thank you so much, Parshan.
Thank you, Laura. And those are some striking stats that really, I think, places us in an important moment in talking about how the burden of debt is being felt on our students, and how inequitable that impact is. And so with those stats, and I think it's a great place for us to transition into our panel here. Part of what we want to chat about with our panelists today is how has that experience been impacting students on the ground? What are some issues that are impacting our students on the ground? And what are some ways that we can move forward as we do our advocacy over the course of the next year? And so we'll start with a question that we put together is, we heard from earlier panels today about the role that the changes in federal government may be playing, and how we can be expecting these changes. But what can we anticipate will be the role of the federal government in this upcoming presidential administration in financial aid? And I know Adrian is going to unmute. Go ahead, Adrian.
Right now, I would like to speak upon some of the expectations that I think are, some of the expectations and concerns that the students currently have right now with the federal government. The main concern that I'm hearing from my fellow students is that we just aren't sure where that Pell Grant is going to go should we see the disassembly of the Department of Education. So with that Pell Grant, that covers, that's fundamental to those who do borrow and apply for financial aid. That's fundamental to their tuition expenses. So if that were to just be gone one day, that would leave tons of students just wondering, how would I be able to afford college? And that's not even talking just the current students. That's talking the potential students who are in high school. They're looking at colleges, but without that Pell Grant, we have a lot of worries of, how am I going to find this alternate source to pay for higher education? And I think that's the biggest concern, but we're looking forward to how the future goes.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I'll tell you, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts you want to share about your experiences as well.
Yeah, of course. So going off on Adrian's point on, the potential revisions towards FAFSA in particular, one of the things that is currently just been on our minds recently is the changes towards the student aid index, or the SAI model. As of right now, within the changes of FAFSA, it's been very difficult for UC students to kind of prorate that SAI and that aid for non-traditional enrollment periods. So essentially what that looks like is for, let's say, disabled students who might need to take a term off for medical flare. The current landscape as of now is that they'd have to take a term off, and under the SAI, it kind of prohibits them from prorating that aid, so that kind of disassembles their term. So that has potential harm in rendering students not just ineligible for aid, but graduation, especially for non-standard terms. Additionally, this has like later lasting effects in reduced aid eligibility. Last year when I was a freshman, there has been like a lot of like things working towards like me getting work study that through the SAI, when I kind of like was revisioned upon my entrance towards my second semester, it reduced my work study got like significantly reduced. And I know that goes across the board for a lot of my friends, not just here on campus, but throughout the UC system as a whole, and just losing that aid.
Thank you for sharing, Althea and Adrian, both of y'all. And very similarities, very much so. I know our own experiences way back when. My own experience very similar, like just seeing the ways that financial aid gaps play a role in then this pipeline of student debt later on being even more gravely felt. The less sort of financial aid we have, the more ways in which the financial aid displacement happens or reductions in the ability for students to be able to support themselves, the more that impact is felt down the line with the burden of debt, which Laura, you so well put that into perspective for us here. And I'm wondering, what are some ways that from your lens, Laura, like we're seeing that gaps in financial aid pathways early on play a factor in the debt and borrowing for our students down the line?
Yeah, no, definitely happy to answer that. If it's okay, I just wanted to add one more thing to both what Althea and Adrian shared. So, again, and I believe UC President Drake had written a letter to the Department of Education on exactly what was brought up about the inability to prorate the SAI and concerns with that. And of course, that impacts a lot of different students, from students with disabilities to student parents who might not be able to be attending full-time or have to take time off. And I would say also to Adrian's point that even, if the Department of Education isn't disbanded entirely, it's not unreasonable to think that the incoming administration might not fill, like as people leave the Department of Education, they may not fill those seats. So there'll be fewer and fewer people there to help with any problems that our students are facing. So I think there's also that concern that like when even if ED still exists, if we're trying to like get movement and changes in certain areas, there may be fewer people working there who we can actually like get those changes made. But to your question, Parshan, in California, which, compared to other states in the nation has relatively robust state need-based financial aid, we still know that the lowest income students have to pay a really hefty share of their family income to cover costs after available grant aid. And that's, number one, due to high cost of living, and also to the fact that the Cal Grant program, the state's main need-based financial aid program, needs to be strengthened and needs to be reformed. And so I'm sure everyone's familiar with the tremendous efforts of many advocates to reform Cal Grant. And, while there have been advancements over the last several years, which do benefit students, the fact remains that there are students who are unable to receive awards because they are older students. Even if they do receive an award for non-tuition costs, that amount has stagnated. It's currently $1,648, and if it had kept pace with inflation, it would be worth over $8,500 today. So it really just underscores, especially in the state of California, the need to continue our advocacy to have more robust need-based aid. And it'll be even more important with what might be happening on the federal level.
Super real. And it's especially sort of concerning to that point where we have numbers like, national numbers like the national student debt amount of $1.7 trillion, or the fact that 45 million Americans are carrying the student loan debt burden, that we're reiterating this cycle of financial pressures on our students. There was a recent number that in some conversations with folks that came out that in the UC system this past year, we can amount a lot of the reasons for that being better FAFSA, but there's more students that are being enrolled and less students that are receiving Cal Grant compared to the prior year. So they had more enrollment and less Cal Grant recipients this year than compared with the previous year, which is striking to me. So and I'm going to kind of circle back to this question of what can be the anticipation of the role of federal government with this incoming presidential administration in financial aid, seeing if any of our other panelists would like to add on to that. If not, we can jump into the next question that I have for the panelists as well. Cool. No worries. Yeah. So there's a lot, and we all have heard quite a bit from folks already about this, and I'm sure this is going to be top of mind for everybody as well. So we'll have more opportunities to chat. But the next question I kind of had for y'all is, we know there's a lot of anxiety and stress being felt by our mixed status communities, mixed status students and households, especially also with our undocumented students. So what can undocumented students expect? And what about mixed status families? And what can be the expectations there?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start with this one. So as of right now, financial aid for undocumented students has really been a really large and concerning point. Some of my friends at UCI who are currently undocumented just received their financial aid as of a couple weeks ago. And upon speaking towards their administration at UCI, their chancellor has mentioned that these changes and revisions towards financial aid, especially towards like undocumented students, will be continuously worked upon and mitigated on the incoming year, but that's particularly in the scope of healthcare. Just speaking towards like my undocumented peers from UCI, I personally come from like a community like with a lot of undocumented folks, and so like while I personally am not undocumented myself, like this is still very much an issue tied to my community. A lot of folks who barely just got their financial aid, if they did, have like experienced a lot of financial and housing and food insecurity over the course of like the past few quarters. And that has been just very concerning, just because, as we all know, the housing crisis is not necessarily being alleviated anytime soon. And it's especially like really concerning in areas, in like college areas where like cost of living is very high, especially for students who really need that financial aid to help just have a roof over their heads. So that's really just a big concern for us at the UC system. And we're still kind of like trying to find our way through and around these policy issues.
Yeah, Adrian, go ahead.
And to add on to the cost of living, the housing insecurity, many undocumented students live with their families who are first generation to the United States. So this means that they're relied upon to help their families kind of gain their footing at first. So there's that balance. It's almost like working a part-time job as you're going to school, but you're not getting those part-time job wages. So you have to figure out how to balance the responsibilities of, helping out your family, maintaining your education, and then your own basic needs. So that's something that the undocumented students here also tend to see a lot, seen as in the CSU, we have a lot who live in the nearby area of their campuses. So when they're not dealing with housing insecurity and high costs of living, it's a lot of responsibility and dependence that they owe to their families, and the work that has to be put in to make sure that everyone is living well.
Exactly. And I would add just a couple other points as well. You know, in California, undocumented students can apply for and receive institutional and state financial aid, which is great. They cannot, unfortunately, apply for federal aid. There's an issue with mixed status families where students who are documented really are in a very difficult position if they are unable to put down information for their parents, say. So there's efforts to try to be able to make the CADA, the California Dream Act application, available to documented students as well from mixed status families. And then I would also just add as well, when we're looking at the trends we see in student borrowing in California, and we're seeing, you know, how low income students are more likely to borrow, you know, it makes me think about access to intergenerational wealth, right? And like whether or not you have family members who, like, even if you don't get enough financial aid, you can turn to your aunt and say, hey, could I just borrow like $500 so I don't have to take that out? And I would imagine that that issue is compounded for undocumented students, like to Adrian's point, for those who are, you know, first generation in California. So a couple other thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys, you all bringing that up as well. You know, we see that a lot happening in this past year. One of the hats that I had the pleasure of wearing and working with is with a coalition called FA for All, Financial Aid for All Coalition, is looking and tracking the financial aid completion efforts in California and supporting with that. And we do see that impact being made, specifically this past year, seeing a huge reduction in the number of students from mixed status households who have filled out their financial aid applications. We do see the reduction in you know, access to CADA over a long period of years. And this year, including since almost 10 years of consistency reductions in CADA numbers. And with the, even with what's happening at the federal level, that's probably likely not going to be changing in the trend. But it is definitely important to elevate for those watching here and at home that we do have in California access for mixed status household students to be able to apply for CADA instead of FAFSA. So if you are from a mixed status household and you would like to fill out your financial aid application, but for whatever reason you cannot do so with FAFSA, you can opt in and fill out a CADA instead. And this is the kind of cool thing about, shout out to CSAC, that they worked out as we were learning and doing a lot of this work as we were going. First, it was to make sure folks can fill out some application so they can get financial aid. Then to also have the back end fix available so that students can later on apply and transfer their financial aid material so that they can get FAFSA as well. So if you want to fill out CADA now as you wait for your FAFSA to go through, and then you want to transfer it to FAFSA so you can get your Pell Grant, what have you, that is an option. And that's a very, very important move that was made in California, which we don't really see in many other states. Again, shout out to CSAC. So, you know, we want to also, I also want to kind of mention and talk about a little bit the impact that we're seeing with student debt on gender disparities. And we do see nationally that 2/3 of student debt is owed by women. And I think that's a striking statistic to look at when we're considering who is bearing the worst parts of the student debt crisis. But we've talked a lot about issues facing our communities, our current and former students, and all the student borrowers in this pipeline. But now we want to kind of chat about what are some solutions that we can consider. What are some actions and steps that institutions and policymakers can take to help ensure that as many students as possible are accessing and getting financial aid. So let's, I want to go to that for a minute and ask our panelists, what are some suggestions and things that you would like to see happen? In no particular order. Anybody who wants to jump on.
I can go first. I kind of touched upon it, but in order to ensure that all students are getting the financial aid they deserve, I'm a real big advocate for Cal Grant reform. And increasing those the eligibility of being able to receive Cal Grant would help so much. Anything from the student parents who have taken a couple years from education school to go back and have that support to get their education finally. And then we also have the GPA requirements, which would help a lot to those, as we see those foster youth and homeless who struggle with housing insecurity tend to have lower GPAs in high school than students who don't deal with those issues. So to have that GPA requirement increase would allow the Cal Grant to affect more students there.
Yeah, and just like following through with that, the Cal Grant Equity Framework, it unfortunately did not pass the last legislative cycle, but I really do believe that, like, the students who are entering systems of higher education who come from like low income backgrounds, who come from like non-traditional backgrounds would greatly just benefit from like just having a lot of those like barriers kind of like reduced. And additionally, like we have to ensure safeguards for undocumented students. AB 2587, which was the Opportunity for All bill, which essentially would have expanded work study for undocumented students, was unfortunately vetoed by the governor. And so that, in addition to a lot of the like policy situations that undocumented students have experienced within like the last few years, especially this year, has like really placed them in just an environment of like precarity. Where is this aid going? Who will be receiving all this aid? And also just having that access to opportunity. I think the whole having access to financial aid isn't just about like being able to sustain ourselves and being able to exist within the university itself, but really having access for that opportunity. My only goal, as to why I really wanted to enter higher education is to really lift my family off like of poverty. I come from a single mother, attended Title I schools my entire life, and now have the privilege of attending a school like UC Berkeley. And so like access to financial aid, and having a community with students of a similar background as me, like it's not just about us like being here and being able to study. It's about being able to have that lifeline, not just for ourselves, but for our families back home. And so having these policies like an increase for the Cal Grant Equity Framework, working around that, and also having policies like AB 2587, which would increase opportunity for work study for undocumented students, is really imperative as we like move forward in this landscape.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. And of course, supporting our undocumented students. A couple just thoughts. So in terms of Cal Grant reform, indexing the Access Award to inflation is really important because the Access Award that helps cover non-tuition costs has, as I mentioned earlier, dramatically lost value. So making sure that it doesn't continue to lose value over time. And of course, hopefully also increasing that base amount as well. Also, to Adrian's point, allowing for fewer units to reestablish one's GPA for older students. So if they may not have access to their high school GPA from many decades ago or whatnot, having a quicker a path to reestablishing their GPA so that they can be eligible for Cal Grant. And then, of course, removing the time out of high school barrier that's faced by all students. Well, it's not faced by community college students, which is great. That barrier was removed about 3 years ago. So that's terrific, but we also need to remove that for students at the other segments as well. And then a couple other thoughts, you know, there are requirements that institutions verify certain students who apply for financial aid. So just when you apply, that's not the end of the process, right? You still might be called back for more documentation, but there are times when institutions will ask students to verify their information when they don't need to be asking them that, or having them jump through certain hoops that make it difficult. And sometimes students give up or they hit a barrier. And so I think institutions really reevaluating their process for helping students get through the application process and not putting them through unnecessary steps is really, really important. And then the final thing that I'll mention too is the UC has an education finance model, an EFM, which is really quite progressive actually compared to universities throughout the country. And one of the things that that's happened under President Drake is he reduced the amount of self-help that Pell Grant students must contribute, right? So it used to be that if a student at UC would not pay more than about $9,000 to $10,000 a year out of pocket, and the rest of the cost of attendance was filled in by state, institutional, and federal aid. But then that amount was dropped to, I believe, somewhere around $7,500 for Pell Grant recipients. And I really appreciate the fact that there's this acknowledgement that certain groups of students may not have access to the same resources as others. And so just kind of keeping that in mind as the different segments are kind of thinking through their own financial aid packaging policies. That's an element that I think is progressive.
Exactly. And I appreciate everybody's comments, and especially this highlighting of the ways in which these gaps, these cracks in the pipeline, in the early side of the pipeline of affordability, then sort of result and emulate themselves in the outcome of further burden of debt on students. And that's not just about student debt, but about economic mobility and access to a better living standards for yourselves and your families. So really, really appreciate folks sharing that and elevating that in your responses. And once again, sort of echoing the need for Cal Grant reform, folks, right? As meant for our students and our panelists, everybody shared, we are not done with Cal Grant reform. We got very close. We have to reimagine and restart this work, but we will, and we'll get it there because we need to do that. We have just too much at stake with our students and our communities, and access to higher education at stake for everybody. And so we need to keep that momentum and that work going, and not to give up despite all the difficulties that are there, despite all the challenges that are going on, despite the narratives and things that are happening at the national level. We have a lot of reason to be optimistic and a lot of reason to be excited about the work and road ahead, and to keep that work going. But I want to go to our next questions in a second, and do a quick follow-up around the last question of what progress was made in this front. So we talked about sort of what needs to happen on the affordability movement, and some folks started to tap into this, but what are some things that have happened in the college affordability sphere more broadly that we should take a moment to recognize and celebrate, and that helps address the issue of college affordability and student debt? So maybe a little bit of a curveball, but if folks want to tap in on that, that would be great.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I think it was fantastic of all the work of advocates back in 2021, the removal of the age and time out of high school requirement for Cal Grants for community college students. So that has brought in hundreds of thousands of students into the Cal Grant program who otherwise wouldn't have gotten it. You know, there have been certainly like gains in over the last decade in terms of increasing the access award by a couple of $100. The competitive program that still exists, they had at one point increased the number of awards for older and returning students. And I think also the segments are doing really good work to kind of look at their packaging practices and taking total cost of attendance into account. You know, when I started doing this work many moons ago, it was like people were surprised when you would say, higher ed leaders were surprised when you would talk to them. And legislators were surprised about saying, you know, it's the non-tuition costs as well. There was such a focus on tuition and fees, which of course is an important component, but we know that the majority of college costs are non-tuition costs. So I think the recognition of that has been hugely important.
Thank you, Laura. Adrian?
One of our previous progressions that we've seen in CSSA was a bill that we supported in the previous cycle, which was AB 2458. And this bill had to do with assuring that student parents had their cost of living accurately reflected with the financial aid. And seen as, you know, that's a group of students who we're starting to notice more. We need to advocate for the student parents more. I'm glad to see that they've been able to get that help that they need to help raise those children as they're getting their education. I believe they're one of the groups that requires that extra help, and I was very glad to see that it was signed into law.
Cheers to that, Adrian. I appreciate you bringing that up. Althea?
Yeah, and I think on my end, like the passing of AB 132, which was proposed back in 2021, which essentially institutionalized permanent summer financial aid. I took classes over the summer, and you know, a lot of the themes that carried in those classes was just the extreme gratitude of being able to have that aid over the summer. A lot of students, whether or not they take classes in person or online, need that aid, whether it be to support their families, whether it be supporting themselves or their children. So like just instituting those things and just having leeway for the students has just been like really nice. And I'm personally very grateful that it has been enacted by the time I was a freshman. So yeah, just that tidbit too.
Amazing. Shout out to UCSA for that work. I happened to be on the staff at the time over there, so I'm glad you brought that up. All right. Laura, I saw you unmuting again, so passing it back to
Yeah,
you.
no, I was just thinking with Adrian's comments, in recent years, the creation of the Access Award for student parents as well as for foster youth, and many reforms that were made to help increase access to Cal Grants for foster youth and the amount that they receive. Also great work that was done with JBay on SAP and having more equitable SAP policies.
Yeah.
And then of course, I mean, and this has been around for a little while now, but of course, like the DREAM Act and have, you know, all the work that's been done to support our undocumented students.
I appreciate you name dropping all these major movements in the financial aid and affordability landscape. You mentioned SAP, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this because not only were I think everybody in this panel, the organizations were co-sponsors, and it happened last cycle, but it's a very important moment because it is just going into effect this academic year, and that's AB 789 by Assemblymember Mark Behrman from last year, which essentially makes it so if a student is failing to meet their satisfactory academic progress, and that's what SAP stands for, which is basically, you know, your GPA, your timely completion of your academic trajectory, and you miss the track on that. Previously, there wasn't a guarantee of you being able to continue getting financial aid, and the state financial aid and federal financial aid could get reduced and taken away. What this bill does is it says if you have extenuating circumstances that can qualify you within those categories, such as basic needs crisis, homelessness, loss in the family, what have you, that you may and can now appeal so you can continue to get financial aid. And that's a very technical bill, but a very, very huge step forward in the pathway to making sure students who need these financial resources the most don't lose access to the funding that they need to continue their education and therefore go into the debt cycle. And there was a similar effort that I want to shout out here. It made it quite far in the legislature. Hopefully, it will be reintroduced again. But that was AB 1160 that was sponsored by Next Gen that was trying to address the issues and impacts of student fees and delinquent fees and how institutions were engaging in certain practices to force students to pay what they need to pay institutions. And those practices often were harmful to student borrowers and stopping them from being able to take their classes and what have you, or even sending them to collections. And so just getting rid of some of those harmful practices that institutions engage in. And that bill made it quite far, but then didn't get signed. So, maybe we can try it again and go at it again. I'm personally excited to do that if it happens. But I know we've talked about a few questions now, and I want to give an opportunity to our audience to also add any questions you have in the Q&A section. And we'll go ahead and ask the panelists. But I have one more question for our esteemed panelists here before we get to audience Q&A, which is, we've talked a lot about things that are issues in this landscape and things that are potential approaches and policies that we could pursue in this landscape. But what would you say to a student or a family about applying for financial aid or the future of their financial aid? If a parent or a student is asking you, what is it about the future of financial aid, what would you tell them? So feel free to munch on that. In the meantime, I'm going to open up our Q&A and let's see what audience questions are coming up.
Well, I know it's a very complicated time right now, and I would say definitely apply for financial aid to take advantage of all of the available resources out there. And I think it especially sends a message to policymakers in California in particular about the need for financial aid. I think when California lawmakers are seeing the aggregate need, it helps provide more support and more advocacy to move Cal Grant reform along. So I think also, reaching out to your financial aid offices if you need support in completing the financial aid process as well, to make sure that, if you need any help along the way, even after you've submitted the application, that you're able to receive it.
Yeah, thank you for bringing on that point, Laura. As an organizer at Berkeley, I recognize the importance of institutional visibility, especially for students who might not really be considered within the university. We can't really advocate, or as a student advocate, we can't really advocate for things if there's not a lot of demand for it, or if if certain people don't want to speak up, or are kind of second guessing their situation, whether it be because they've just been exposed to it or just don't really know how to navigate it. And additionally, to my understanding, I believe those who applied to FAFSA, there was a 12% decrease this past year. And, it is a difficult time, but I would also like to say that FAFSA is not the only pathway towards financial aid. There are multiple supplemental programs, whether it be from the state or from your school, that provide just a lot of that financial aid for housing, food, or other basic needs. I know across the UC we have basic needs center that is open for students. So yeah, really just expanding the scope.
And I think one thing that it kind of goes with what both of you touched upon, would be that the students sometimes often feel that imposter syndrome kind of feeling whenever they see free resources for them to utilize. I know me, I would never have guessed that I would have gotten financial aid if I hadn't tried. So when students aren't sure that they'll get it, that's kind of pushing them away from, utilizing that resource that's there for them. And I think something that I would go and, spread to the students is to just try it and see what you could receive in terms of financial aid. You never know if that might propel you to kind of explore a new opportunity that could help you discover your career. But by kind of giving them that little push that, hey, this is for you, these resources are here for you. That's something big that I see from a lot of students who are kind of a little nervous to ask for that much.
Thank you, Adrian, and all of our panelists. This has been really, really cool to elevate this, especially because, and I think I'm hearing there's a lot of themes of, there is a lot of resources available for our students in higher education, and we just need to do a better job at connecting students to those resources. I know there's been a lot of improvement in the basic needs world as well, in creating more access to resources with the likes of rapid rehousing programming funds available in institutions of higher ed, and the likes of basic needs, expansion of basic needs and food pantries and other basic needs pathways. So elevating that as well, to the note you made of making sure students know that there are resources. We had a comment in the comment and a question, two different. So a comment from a senior in high school, I think a senior in high school, that it's their observation that the best possible way to support young people in becoming their best selves is to give them all the tools they need to do that. And this includes giving them information about what they need, and what they can share with the world. And that they also made the note of saying it's interesting that we ask young people to pay for education, and when that is a disservice to our young people and the ability of them to be able to help give back to the community and society. I'm curious on that note, what do folks think about this idea of making students pay for their education? And any thoughts that folks have there would be appreciated.
I think that I agree with the audience member who left that comment, and I think that we need to do all we can to give Californians and students the tools that they need to succeed. I mean, I think that the benefits of earning a higher education credential benefit both the student themselves and the state, with increased tax receipts, a greater brain trust, less reliance on public benefits. And certainly students who, like, for example, our first generation students may not have equal or equitable access to kind of like the knowledge of how to navigate the college system as some of their peers. And so it just seems to be inequitable to kind of be putting the burden of work and borrowing on them. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Laura. I think this is reminding me of earlier on, Althea, I think it was you who were sharing about some of the challenges facing some specific students, like if somebody is facing a disability or what have you. And I've always kind of found it fascinating that there's even these self-help expectation formulas where we essentially say in all of our financial aid modelings, institutions, and even more recently at the Middle Class Scholarship Act, the state is sort of setting this expectation that a student has to, at minimum, somewhat support their own, pay for their own education. They have to sort of, whether it's 7,800, as Laura was sharing in the EFM model, that the UC actually decreased it. Previously used to be $10,000, then reduced it to 7,800. And similar modeling in the Middle Class Scholarship Act as well, and where we see that the student has to support themselves at least somewhat. Do you all believe that this is something that should be? You know, should students have to pay for their own education, or is this something that the institution, we don't see that at high schools, we don't see that at middle school. So why should we see that at the higher education, especially when we have stats like 1.1 million shortage of skilled workers that we need to graduate and send to the workforce within the next 10 years. So what are y'all's thoughts on that? And curious if you could share your perspectives, Althea and Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, like this just goes back to like the point, and I think it would do us all good to remember that the UC system used to be free. We did not have to like pay a single cent until a few decades ago. And so, you know, as a first generation student myself, I didn't really have like the guidance except for like the teachers that I had back home who would tell me who would essentially guide me as to like what I like would need to consider in terms of like just existing here within the academy. Moreover, I think it's important to kind of holistically consider the different challenges in accordance to each campus. For me personally, last year I like had a rough time trying to find housing. Housing is not a guaranteed a thing here at UC Berkeley. It's only really guaranteed for your first year, whether you are a traditional student or transfer. And so many students have like started to look for off-campus housing by the end of their first semester. And so trying to look for like off-campus housing towards the first semester you arrive in college, whether or not you be a traditional student or not, is just a very tall ask, especially for students who've never really had the opportunity to navigate this landscape before. And additionally, I'm personally very grateful to have that summer aid, because that summer aid was then just rolled over towards like my like apartment. If I didn't have access to that summer aid, I like would have taken even more loans in order for me to like just secure housing for this year. And I didn't even spend summer here at Berkeley. So you know, going back, it's just having all these like unexpected charges or things that you might not necessarily consider really is a tall order for students. And so I personally don't think that students should be bearing that responsibility, just because for a lot of us who enter these like spaces of higher education, we are the first. And so we really don't know what we're getting into. So yeah, just, and there really is no like support or like enough mentorship programs to essentially guide us. So yeah, just a few things to consider.
And
Absolutely.
one thing I really like that you brought up was the unexpectedness of some situations that can arise. And I'm thankful that mental health awareness for students and all the different counseling and psychological services that our systems have been able to create for those students are there. I'm glad that that's been something that's looked into, because when you come into higher education and you're on your own, it's sometimes very scary most of the time. So by being able to have those counseling services there, it really helps the students it helps their ability to focus on their education and really think about what they're doing with their career, by having that safety net on there. But I wanted to look at it another way. I like to look at it, the bigger picture, and seeing how the state can invest in higher education. And when we talk about how it should be in a beautiful world, we would love to see the state investing and allowing students to go to universities for cheap or free prices. Now, I know in my own personal goals, I plan on staying in California. So when we do our advocacy, we want to emphasize that most of our students are going to stay and benefit the entire California community. So we want to look at it like an investment. And when you begin to put those financial barriers on having to pay large prices for education, that's when you really start to see our priorities. And are we focusing on social mobility, or how are we helping them while we're putting these barriers on education? It's just kind of the economic outlook.
100%. And education is an investment. I really appreciate that point that you brought up, Adrian, that it's an investment that's going to pay off at the long haul by the state. And we know that from body of research that's proven this. So we're at time, y'all. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise, your experiences, and your lovely selves here. Thank you to the audience. And really, we appreciate y'all for sharing this quality time with us. And I'll pass it back to the next team for the rest of the agenda.